David, oh God, we shouldn't, not here. The words were a whisper, a useless breath against the frantic heat of his mouth on my neck. My fingers dug into the hard muscle of his shoulders, a protest my body refused to acknowledge. The scent of old books and his leather chair filled my senses, mixing with the sharp, forbidden smell of our sweat. His hands were under my shirt, skilled and urgent, his thumbs brushing the lace edge of my bra. Every rational thought screamed stop, but the sound that escaped my lips was a broken moan when he lifted me effortlessly onto the polished surface of his desk, scattering legal pads and blueprints onto the plush carpet below. The cool wood was a shock against my bare thighs, and I gasped, a sound that was half fear, half pure, unadulterated pleasure. He was everywhere, his presence overwhelming, his desire a current that pulled me under. The last thread of my resistance snapped. Please, don't stop. That was then. A moment of reckless fire that burned everything down. But it didn't start that way. Fire never does. It starts with a spark, a little bit of warmth in a cold place. 6 months before that night, I was just Maya, 22 years old, a college degree that felt useless, and a desperate need for a job that would let me disappear from my own life for a while. The Thompson house wasn't just a job, it was an escape. When the wrought iron gates glided open and I drove up the winding, perfectly manicured driveway, it felt like entering a different world. The house was magnificent, a modern marvel of glass and stone that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. It was perfect. So perfect that it felt entirely empty. My first meeting was a blur of polite efficiency. Eleanor Thompson, stunning in a tailored suit, barely looked up from her phone as she explained my duties. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of ambition that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The children, a boy and a girl, were sweet and quiet, with the reserved sadness of kids who were used to being handed off to strangers. And then there was David. He was the one who shook my hand, who looked me in the eye and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I saw a successful man, a handsome husband, a doting father. I didn't see the loneliness hiding just beneath the surface. I didn't see the spark. I was just the nanny, a temporary fixture in their perfect, hollow life. I had no idea I was about to become the one thing that would shatter it all. The first few weeks were a study in routine, a quiet rhythm I set for myself within the silent, cavernous spaces of the Thompson house. My world was defined by the children's schedule. Mornings were a gentle whirlwind of waking 7-year-old Leo and 5-year-old Sophie, of coaxing them through breakfast. Their small chatter, a welcome noise against the gleaming, sterile surfaces of the kitchen. I'd braid Sophie's hair, her fine blonde strands feeling like silk under my fingers, and I'd quiz Leo on his spelling words during the drive to their private school. My days were filled with their absence, a time for me to reset their world, making beds, tidying playrooms, and preparing simple, healthy meals. Then, the afternoon would bring them back, a wave of energy that I would channel into homework, art projects on the massive kitchen island, or adventures in the sprawling, perfectly landscaped backyard that felt more like a park than a private garden. I was good at my job. I was professional, kind, and firm when needed. I was a ghost, a silent partner in the raising of these children, and that was exactly how I wanted it. That was the role. Eleanor was more of a concept than a person in those early days. She was a trail of expensive perfume in the morning, a list of instructions left on the counter, and a clipped, efficient voice on the phone confirming a late arrival. I rarely saw her. Her days started before mine and ended long after I had tucked the children into their beds, read them stories until their breathing deepened into the soft cadence of sleep. The house was hers, every cool, minimalist piece of furniture, every stark, imposing piece of art was a testament to her taste. Yet she moved through it like a visitor, her focus always aimed at the glowing screen in her hand. Her interactions with me were brief, transactional. She was not unkind, merely absent. A powerful, beautiful woman who seemed to have outsourced the warmth in her own home. David, however, was a constant presence. His office, a stunning room walled with glass that overlooked the backyard, was his domain. Most days, he was in there, the faint sound of his calls a distant hum in the house's quiet. But unlike Eleanor, he emerged. He would appear in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, a coffee mug in his hand, and he would watch. At first, I was sure he was just watching the children. I'd be on the floor with Leo, deep in concentration as we constructed an elaborate Lego fortress, and I'd feel his eyes on us. I'd look up, and he'd be smiling. But the smile wasn't just for his son. It would shift, just for a second, to me. It was an appreciative smile, a soft acknowledgement that lingered a moment too long. He's just happy his son has a playmate, I told myself, quickly looking back down, a strange heat creeping up my neck. The small kindnesses began to accumulate, little gestures that felt disproportionately significant in the emotional vacuum of that house. He learned I liked a specific type of tea, and a new box of it quietly appeared in the pantry. When he saw me struggling to bring in the groceries one afternoon, he was there in an instant, taking the heaviest bags from my hands, his fingers brushing mine for a fleeting second. A jolt, small but sharp, went through me. We both muttered apologies and pulled away, but for the rest of the day, I could still feel the phantom warmth of his touch. One evening, after I'd finally gotten the kids to sleep after a particularly difficult day, I was slumped at the kitchen island, exhausted. He came in, not saying a word, and poured 2 glasses of wine, pushing one across the cool marble towards me. "Tough day at the office?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. We sat there in the quiet, sipping the expensive wine, and we talked. He asked me about my degree, about my dreams, about the life I'd left behind to be here. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made me feel seen. It was intoxicating. "You're a natural at this, you know," he said, his eyes searching mine. "They're happier now. The house is happier." I didn't know what to say, so I just mumbled a thank you, my gaze falling to the swirling red liquid in my glass. The compliment was professional, but the atmosphere felt deeply personal. The glances became more frequent, less easy to dismiss. I would be cleaning up after lunch, standing at the sink, and I would feel his eyes on my back from his office. I'd be in the yard, pushing Sophie on the swing, the sun warm on my shoulders, my simple t-shirt and shorts feeling suddenly inadequate, and I would know he was watching. The moment that I could no longer lie to myself happened on a bright Saturday afternoon. Eleanor was, as usual, at some work-related function. I had set up a sprinkler for the kids, and they were shrieking with delight, running through the cool spray. I was sitting on the edge of the patio, laughing as Leo tried to aim a water gun at me. I was relaxed, happy, my hair escaping its ponytail, a few damp strands clinging to my face. I looked up towards the house, and there he was, standing at the glass wall of his office, unmoving. He wasn't on the phone, not looking at a computer. He was just watching me. His gaze was slow, deliberate. It started with my face, then drifted down my neck, over my shoulders and arms, down to my bare legs, stretched out in the sun. It wasn't a leer, it wasn't vulgar. It was a quiet, thorough appreciation. It was the way a man looks at a woman, not the way an employer looks at his nanny. My breath caught in my throat. I felt exposed, a butterfly pinned under glass. A strange, thrilling, and deeply shameful flutter went through my stomach. I turned away quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs, shouting something nonsensical to Leo about his aim. But the connection had been made. The air between us was now charged with an unspoken awareness. He had seen me, and he knew that I had seen him seeing me. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed of my guest room, I couldn't stop replaying that moment. I felt a profound sense of guilt for the tiny, treacherous part of me that had felt flattered. I told myself it was nothing, a figment of my imagination, a byproduct of the loneliness I felt in this big, empty house. I told myself I needed to be more careful, to keep my distance, to be nothing more than the help. But even as I built those walls in my mind, a dangerous question had already taken root. What was he thinking, in his own room, just down the hall, in the quiet darkness of his perfect, loveless life? The weeks bled into one another, and the rhythm I had established began to change. It started with an extended business trip for Eleanor, a week in London. The announcement was made over a hastily eaten breakfast, her words directed more at her BlackBerry than at her family. When she left, it was as if the house itself exhaled. The tension I hadn't even fully realized was there seemed to seep out of the walls, replaced by a quiet calm. That first night of her absence, after the children were sound asleep, I found myself lingering in the living room, unwilling to retreat to my own room. I was tidying the bookshelves, running my fingers over the spines of books that looked like they had never been opened, when David spoke from the doorway. "Don't feel like you have to do that." I turned, startled. He was holding 2 mugs, the steam rising from them in the soft lamplight. "I made tea," he said, a simple statement that felt like an invitation. That was how it began. Our late-night talks became a ritual, an unspoken appointment in the quiet heart of the sleeping house. It was a space carved out of time, belonging only to us. We would sit on the enormous white sofa, a respectable distance between us, and the carefully constructed walls of employer and employee would slowly crumble. He discovered my passion for drawing. I would often sketch in a small notebook, and one night he asked to see. Hesitantly, I showed him. They were simple drawings, mostly of nature, of places I wanted to see. But there was one of a small, cozy cottage, smoke curling from its chimney. He studied it for a long time. "This is where you'd rather be, isn't it?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, embarrassed. "It's the opposite of this place." He didn't take offense. Instead, he smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "It's the opposite of my life, too," he confessed. And then he opened up. He told me he was never supposed to be a corporate developer. He had been an architect, a student of design who dreamed of building small, sustainable homes that worked with the landscape, not against it. He spoke of materials, of light, of how a home should be a sanctuary, not a statement. As he talked, a passion ignited in his eyes that I had never seen before, a glimpse of the man he was before he had become Mr. Thompson. He was sharing a part of his soul that I was certain Eleanor knew nothing about. I felt like a privileged keeper of a precious secret. Night after night, the confessions deepened. We talked about our families, our childhoods, the small disappointments that shape a life. He had a dry, self-deprecating sense of humor, and the sound of our shared laughter would echo in the vast, silent room, a sound so rare and intimate, it felt almost scandalous. He made the house feel less like a museum and more like a home. He would point out architectural details, explaining the thought process behind them, and in doing so, he was explaining himself. "Eleanor wanted a showcase," he said one night, gesturing to the grand 2-story living room, a place to entertain. "We've lived here for 3 years. We've had exactly 4 dinner parties." He stared into the cold, dark fireplace. "A house this big is only supposed to feel this empty when no one is home. It's not supposed to feel like this when we're all here." He never once spoke ill of his wife, not directly. But the loneliness was a tangible thing, a third presence on the couch with us. I felt a dangerous surge of empathy, a fierce, protective feeling towards this man. I wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to tell him that I understood, but I kept my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The physical boundary between us remained intact, an invisible wall of propriety, until one evening near the end of Eleanor's trip. He had brought out his old portfolio, a heavy leather-bound book filled with his student designs. He was excited, animated, showing me his early work. We were sitting closer than usual, our shoulders almost touching as we leaned over the book spread across the coffee table. He was pointing out a detail on a blueprint, his long, elegant fingers tracing the lines. "This is what I mean by flow," he said, his voice full of its earlier passion. "You want to create a space that pulls you through it, that feels natural." His hand moved to gesture towards me, to emphasize his point, and as it did, it covered mine where it rested on the page. It was an accident, it must have been. But neither of us moved. For a long, suspended moment, the world stopped. All I could feel was the warmth of his hand completely enveloping mine, the slight roughness of his palm, the sheer size and strength of it. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. The air grew thick, heavy, with everything we hadn't said for weeks. The silence stretched, electric and alive. Then, as slowly as it had landed, he lifted his hand. The spell was broken. A deep blush spread across my cheeks, and I couldn't meet his eyes. It's getting late," he stammered, clearing his throat and closing the portfolio with a soft thud. We should get some sleep." He stood up abruptly and was gone, leaving me alone on the couch, my hand still tingling where he had touched it. I could no longer pretend. There was no more denying or rationalizing. What was growing between us wasn't friendship. It was a deep, emotional intimacy that was far more treacherous than a simple, physical flirtation. I had begun to crave his company, to count the hours until the children were asleep and we could have our time. I felt a dark, shameful pang of disappointment when I heard Eleanor was returning the next day. I had started to feel as though I was the one who truly saw him, the one who understood his loneliness. I was the one who could make him laugh. The thought was as seductive as it was destructive. When Eleanor swept back into the house the following evening, all brisk energy and designer luggage, the temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. She gave David a cursory kiss on the cheek that didn't land and handed me a list of new instructions. The easy warmth of the past week vanished. Later, as Eleanor was on a call in her study, David caught my eye from across the great room. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a smile of shared conspiracy, of secret understanding. And in that silent, fleeting moment, I knew with a terrifying certainty that an invisible line had been crossed forever. The affair hadn't started in a bedroom. It had started right here, on this sofa, with whispered confessions and a single, lingering touch. Eleanor's return clamped a lid of icy civility back onto the house. The easy warmth of the past week evaporated, and the silence that fell was no longer peaceful, but fraught with tension. Our late-night conversations ceased as if they had never happened. David retreated back into his office, the door now firmly closed most of the time. When I did see him, the light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a familiar, weary resignation. He looked like a man holding his breath. I felt the loss of our connection like a physical ache, a phantom limb that reminded me of a closeness I now knew I was missing. I tried to focus on my duties, on the children, telling myself that the intimacy we had shared was a temporary illusion, a product of circumstance in a quiet house, but I knew I was lying. A seed had been planted, and in the cold, sterile environment of the Thompson home, it was waiting for a crack in the surface to push through. The crack appeared on a Thursday. It was a small thing, a canceled family vacation. For months, a trip to a rustic cabin in Maine had been the single bright spot on the family calendar. Leo had been talking endlessly about fishing, and Sophie had a new bucket and spade specifically for the rocky beaches. It was the one thing David seemed genuinely excited about. The announcement of its cancellation came during a rare dinner where all four of them were present. Eleanor delivered the news between bites of salad, her tone casual, almost dismissive. A major case she'd been working on was going to trial earlier than expected. The trip was off. Postponed, she said, but the word held no promise. I watched as the light drained from the children's faces. Leo stabbed at his chicken, his jaw tight, while Sophie's lower lip began to tremble. David said nothing. He simply placed his fork down on his plate with a quiet click, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the tense dining room. He didn't look at his wife. He just stared at a fixed point on the far wall, his expression unreadable, a statue carved from disappointment. The explosion came later, long after I had put the heartbroken children to bed. I was in my room, trying to read, but the oppressive silence of the house was too distracting. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound from downstairs. A man's voice, tight with a restraint that was about to break. I couldn't make out the words, only the raw emotion. Then came Eleanor's response, sharp and clipped. The voices grew louder, angrier, rising from the living room. I quietly opened my door a crack, telling myself it was to make sure the children didn't wake up, but I knew I was a willing eavesdropper, a moth drawn to a destructive flame. The words were clearer now, fragments of a marriage tearing itself apart. It's always the firm, always the next big case. David's voice was raw, laced with a bitterness I'd never heard. They're your children, Eleanor. They exist outside of your schedule. That trip was the one thing we had. Oh, don't be so dramatic, David. Her voice shot back, cold and sharp as glass. This is for us, for this house, for their schools. Do you have any idea the kind of pressure I'm under? The sacrifices I make? Sacrifices? What you call sacrifice, I call absence. You're not here. Not really. You're a ghost in a power suit. I'm so tired of it, Eleanor. I'm so tired of being lonely, goddammit. The word hung in the air. Lonely. It was the same word he had used in our quiet confessions, but now it was a weapon, hurled across the battlefield of their living room. Lonely? She scoffed, her laugh a brittle, ugly sound. How dare you? You live this incredible life that I provide, surrounded by a family you barely notice, and you have the nerve to call yourself lonely? Don't you dare put that on me. Maybe if you were the man I thought I married, you wouldn't have to be. The cruelty of her words sucked the air from my lungs. It was a low blow, aimed to wound, and it was followed by a deafening silence, then the violent, splintering sound of a door slamming shut. And then nothing. The silence that returned was heavier, more profound than before. My heart was pounding in my chest. I felt sick, like an intruder who had trespassed on the most private, painful corner of their lives. I should have stayed in my room, locked the door, pretended I'd heard nothing, but I couldn't. I was no longer a detached employee. I was an ally. His ally. After waiting a few minutes, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor, I crept downstairs. The living room was empty. A single lamp cast long shadows across the pristine, untouched furniture. The door to Eleanor's study was closed. I found him in his office. The room was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the great glass wall, illuminating his silhouette. He was standing there, staring out into the blackness of the yard, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He looked smaller, defeated. The confident, charming man was gone, and in his place was a stranger, hollowed out by grief. He must have seen my reflection in the glass, because he spoke without turning, his voice thick and rough. I imagine you heard that. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He finally turned to face me, and in the dim light I could see the glistening track of a tear on his cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. "Welcome to the real Thompson family," he said, a bitter, broken smile gracing his lips. "Not the one we put in the Christmas cards." He took a long swallow of the whiskey. "She's right, you know. In a way. I'm not the man she married. That man had dreams. That man was alive." He walked towards me, his movements heavy, weary. "Then you came here, Maya," he whispered, stopping just a few feet away. "You came into this mausoleum with your quiet warmth, your easy laughter. You play with the kids, you actually listen to them. You brought life back into this house. And it's been hell. Because it made me realize I've been dead for years." His confession was a weight, a burden he was deliberately placing on my shoulders. He was anointing me as his savior, his witness. It was manipulative, it was wrong, and it worked. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to retreat to the safety of my professional role, but I didn't. I looked at this broken man, and all I felt was a profound, overwhelming need to comfort him. I stepped forward, into his space, and gently took the whiskey glass from his trembling hand, placing it on the edge of his desk. I looked into his eyes, dark pools of pain and longing. Then, I lifted my hand and placed it on his arm. A deliberate touch, a declaration. The barrier was gone, forever. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "For what it's worth, I see you, David." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his body, as if a great tension had finally been released. Then he covered my hand with his own, his skin warm, his grip firm. We stood there for a long time, in the darkness of his office, in the wreckage of his marriage, bound by a single touch that said everything. The question was no longer if something was going to happen between us. The only question left was when the days following the fight were thick with a toxic silence. Eleanor and David moved through the house like ghosts haunting the same space, their interactions reduced to curt, necessary exchanges. The grand rooms, already cold, now felt like a tomb. I felt like a prisoner, a reluctant warden to their children, trapped in the suffocating atmosphere of a dying marriage. David was a shadow of the man who had shared his dreams with me. He was closed off, his eyes dull, the easy warmth he once showed me now locked away. The shared secret of his confession, once a bond, now felt like a dangerous weight between us. And then, Eleanor left. A last-minute conference in Chicago. A week. The moment the black town car pulled away from the curb, the entire house seemed to sigh in relief. The tension didn't just ease, it shattered. It was a tangible thing, a lifting of pressure that made me realize I too had been holding my breath. That night the ritual resumed, but it was different. The pretense of innocence was gone. burned away by the raw honesty of his fight and the vulnerability he had shown me. When he found me in the living room after the children were asleep, there was a new intensity in his eyes, a sense of purpose. He didn't bring tea. He brought a bottle of deep red wine and 2 glasses. "A survivor's drink," he said, his mouth twisting into a wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't sit on the far side of the couch. He sat closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that our knees were only inches apart. We talked, but the subjects were safer now, lighter. We steered clear of the deep, painful topics of his marriage. Instead, we talked about movies, about music, about ridiculous things the children had said. We were building a new world, a fragile bubble of normalcy and warmth within the cold, silent walls of his life. And with every shared laugh, with every sip of the rich, intoxicating wine, the bubble grew stronger, and the space between us grew smaller. The rain started around midnight, a soft patter at first that grew into a steady, hypnotic drumming against the vast panes of glass. It seemed to shrink the enormous room, pulling the walls in around us, creating an island of soft light and quiet sound in the midst of the dark, stormy night. The conversation eventually dwindled, the silence between us no longer needing to be filled. It was a comfortable, charged silence, alive with unspoken things. I could feel his eyes on me, and I didn't turn away. It was a different kind of gaze than before. It was no longer just appreciative or lonely. It was hungry. I watched him watch me, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum against my ribs. From my perspective, I saw the way the lamplight carved shadows into the handsome lines of his face. His eyes, dark and serious, moved over my features as if he were trying to memorize them. They traced the curve of my jaw, the line of my collarbone peeking out from the neck of my sweater, the few strands of hair that had escaped my ponytail. And then, his gaze settled on my mouth. And it stayed there. I felt it like a physical touch, a searing heat that made my lips tingle. My own breath hitched in my throat, and my lips parted slightly, an involuntary invitation. The air between us grew thick, viscous, difficult to breathe. He leaned forward just a fraction of an inch, and his voice was a low whisper, barely disturbing the quiet air. "Maya," he said. It was just my name, but the way he said it was different from ever before. It was freighted with weeks of stolen glances, of shared secrets, of profound loneliness and burgeoning desire. It was a question and a plea all at once. He shifted closer, closing the last few inches between us. He moved so slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, giving me every opportunity to retreat, to shake my head, to say no, to be the sensible girl I was supposed to be. My mind was a deafening scream of warnings. He's married. He's your boss. This is the point of no return. Stop this. But my body was frozen, paralyzed by a will that was not its own. I didn't move. I didn't pull back. His lips touched mine. The first contact was impossibly soft, a gentle, hesitant pressure. It was a question. "Are you sure?" For a single, eternal second, I had a choice. I could have ended it. But the taste of wine on his lips, the feeling of his warmth so close, the culmination of every lonely night and shared confidence, it overwhelmed me. I leaned into him, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible, but it was all the answer he needed. The nature of the kiss changed instantly. The gentleness was consumed by a raw, desperate hunger. His mouth slanted over mine, and he deepened the kiss with a low groan that seemed to come from the very core of his being. It was a kiss of starvation. His hand came up to cradle the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me to him. My own hands, as if with a mind of their own, came to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy beat of his heart beneath my palms. It was clumsy and urgent and utterly overwhelming. It was the taste of wine and loneliness and every forbidden thought we'd ever had. It was wrong, so deeply, irrevocably wrong, and it was the most exquisitely real thing I had ever felt. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. The spell was broken, and the cold, horrifying reality of our actions crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. My fingers flew to my lips, which felt bruised, swollen, and alive. In my mind's eye, I saw Eleanor's sharp, beautiful face. I saw the trusting eyes of Leo and Sophie, asleep in their beds just one floor above us. The word homewrecker, a word I'd only ever read in magazines, screamed in my head. A wave of guilt and self-loathing so powerful it made me dizzy washed over me. But as I looked at him, at the raw emotion and undisguised want in his eyes, another feeling rose up to fight the guilt. It was a powerful, intoxicating, and terrifying feeling of being truly, completely wanted. In that moment, I wasn't the nanny, the help, the invisible girl. I was a woman, desired by this handsome, broken man. The kiss was a transgression, a betrayal, a catastrophic mistake. But it was also a validation, a confirmation that the connection between us was real. We stared at each other in the dim, quiet room, the sound of the rain a mournful witness to what we had just done. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated, and in the chaotic wreckage of my conscience, I knew with a terrifying sense of certainty that I would let him do it again. The 2 days that followed the kiss were a masterclass in exquisite torture. The air in the house was so thick with unspoken electricity, I felt I could barely draw a full breath. We avoided each other with a frantic, clumsy precision that was more intimate than any conversation. If I entered the kitchen, he would suddenly find a reason to leave. If our paths were about to cross in the hallway, I would duck into the laundry room, my heart hammering against my ribs as if I were a fugitive. We were orbiting each other, two celestial bodies held in a powerful, terrifying gravitational pull, terrified of the impending collision. We spoke only when necessary, our voices stiff and formal, using the children as a buffer. Mr. Thompson, Leo needs help with his science project, I'd say, my eyes fixed on the floor. Of course, Maya, thank you, he would reply, his gaze boring into the side of my head. The formality was a farce, a thin veil of professionalism so transparent it was laughable. Beneath it, the real conversation was happening in stolen glances, in the charged silence that fell whenever we were accidentally in the same room. His eyes would find mine across the dining table, and in them I saw not regret, but a raw, impatient hunger that mirrored my own. The kiss had not been an ending, it had been a promise. And we were both just waiting. On the third night of Eleanor's absence, the waiting became unbearable. A restless energy hummed beneath my skin, a potent cocktail of anxiety and a deep, aching anticipation. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the phantom pressure of his lips on mine, the memory of his hand in my hair. I tossed and turned in my bed, the sheets feeling hot and suffocating. Finally, I gave up. I just need some water, I told myself, the excuse flimsy even to my own ears. I wasn't thirsty. I was being summoned. I slipped out of bed and stood for a moment in the quiet darkness of my room. I was wearing what I always wore to sleep, a simple heather gray cotton tank top, soft and worn from countless washes, and a pair of black silk shorts that felt cool against my skin. It was an outfit of pure comfort, with no thought of seduction. And yet, as I caught my faint reflection in the darkened window, I saw myself differently. The moonlight traced the curve of my hip, the silhouette of my breast. For the first time, I wasn't looking at Maya the nanny. I was looking at a woman, a body humming with a desire that was both terrifying and thrillingly alive. My feet were silent on the grand, curving staircase and the cool marble of the entrance hall. The house was asleep, a silent, sleeping beast. I padded into the kitchen, which was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the under-cabinet lighting, and my breath caught in my throat. He was there. He was leaning against the far counter, a glass of water held loosely in one hand, perfectly still. He wasn't surprised. He didn't move. He was waiting for me. He had known I would come. In that instant, the choice was laid bare before me. This was the final threshold. I could have turned around, fled back to the safety of my room, and this fragile, dangerous thing between us might have remained a secret of whispers and a single stolen kiss. He would not have stopped me. I could feel it, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. Running was the last thing my body wanted to do. The silence was absolute, a living entity that filled the space between us. He didn't speak, he just watched me. His eyes, dark and unreadable in the low light, began a slow, deliberate appraisal of my body, and I felt it in every nerve ending. The look was different now. It was stripped of all pretense of friendship or professional courtesy. This was the gaze of a man claiming what he had already decided was his. It started with my face, taking in my sleep-tousled hair and my bare, makeup-free skin. His eyes dropped to my mouth, and I felt a ghost of his kiss there, my lips parting instinctively. His gaze traveled lower, down the column of my throat to the delicate hollows of my collarbones. It rested on the soft swell of my breasts beneath the thin cotton of my tank top. Under the intensity of his stare, I felt my nipples harden, a traitorous, physical confession of my own arousal. A sharp, hot pulse shot through me, settling low in my belly. I drew in a shaky breath, the movement pulling the fabric of my top tighter, revealing even more. His eyes followed the line of my waist, the gentle curve of my stomach, and finally came to rest on the expanse of my bare thighs below the hem of my silk shorts. I felt utterly, completely exposed, as if the flimsy clothes I wore had dissolved, leaving me naked under his inspection. A hot blush crept up my neck, flooding my cheeks. I was vulnerable, and yet I had never felt more powerful. In his eyes, I was not the help. I was not a child. I was pure, unadulterated woman, an object of intense, focused desire. He finally broke the spell by setting his glass down on the granite counter. The soft, deliberate click was the only sound in the room, a signal that the time for waiting was over. He pushed off from the counter and started towards me. He moved with an unnerving slowness, his steps measured, confident. He was not a man hoping for an outcome. He was a man walking towards an inevitability. He didn't rush. He seemed to be savoring this, the final moments of anticipation before the point of no return. He stopped directly in front of me, so close that the heat from his body washed over me, so close I could see the faint stubble on his jaw and the deep, aching need in his eyes. For a moment, he just looked at me, his breath warm on my face. Then, he slowly lifted his hand, not to grab or pull me, but to gently, tenderly, brush a stray piece of hair from my cheek. The pads of his fingers were warm and slightly rough against my skin, and the touch, as light as it was, sent a tremor through my entire body. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear as he finally spoke, his voice a ragged whisper that was my final undoing. Maya. My name. Just my name. But in his mouth, it was a prayer, a confession, and a promise of everything that was to come. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My response was the slight tremble in my legs, the way my head tilted, giving him better access to my neck, the soft, helpless sigh that escaped my lips. It was all the permission he needed. He took my hand, his larger one engulfing mine, and his thumb began to draw slow, hypnotic circles on my palm. He held my gaze for one more long, searing moment, and then, without a word, he began to lead me out of the kitchen. I followed, my heart a wild drum against my ribs, my mind a chaotic swirl of terror and exhilaration. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew I would follow him anywhere. The buildup was over. The decision had been made in the silence, with a look and a touch, and now all that was left was the fall. He led me by the hand through the sleeping house. Each silent step we took on the cold marble floor felt momentous, a footfall on a path from which there was no return. The grand, empty rooms were bathed in a ghostly moonlight, the expensive furniture standing like silent, judgmental witnesses to our procession. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the profound silence. He didn't lead me towards his room, the one he shared with his wife, nor did he lead me up the stairs to mine. Instead, he stopped before a door at the end of the main hall, the guest room, a neutral territory, a space for visitors, a room that belonged to everyone and no one. It felt significant, a tacit acknowledgement of the illicit nature of what was about to happen. This was not a betrayal of his marriage bed, but the creation of a new secret space that was entirely our own. He opened the door and led me inside, closing it behind us. The soft, final click of the latch echoed in the room, a sound that sealed us in and shut the rest of the world out. The room was beautiful and impersonal, decorated in muted tones of gray and cream. Moonlight streamed through a large, uncurtained window, silvering the edges of the perfectly made bed. He didn't rush. He turned me to face him, his hands coming up to gently frame my face. His thumbs stroked my cheekbones, his eyes searching mine in the dim light, a final, silent question. I could have stopped it. Even now, I could have whispered no. But I was past that. I was drowning, and he was the only solid thing in the water. I gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the consent he needed. With excruciating slowness, his hands slid from my face down to the hem of my gray tank top. He paused there for a second, his fingers brushing against the bare skin of my stomach, sending a shiver through me. Then, he gathered the soft cotton in his hands and lifted it over my head, tossing it aside into the darkness. The cool air of the room kissed my heated skin, and I felt a profound wave of vulnerability. I was standing before him, half naked in the moonlight. My bra was black lace, a stark, deliberate contrast to the simple cotton top. It was a secret I had kept under my clothes, a silent admission that some part of me had been fantasizing about this, preparing for it. His breath hitched, a sharp, audible intake of air. His eyes darkened, his gaze drinking in the sight of the delicate lace against my skin, the swell of my breasts. In his undisguised adoration, my vulnerability morphed into a strange, heady sense of power. I had undone him with a simple piece of black lace. His hands came to my waist, his thumbs tracing the line of my silk shorts. This was the final layer, the last barrier. "David," I whispered, my voice trembling, a final, token protest from a conscience that was already lost. This is wrong. We can't." He silenced me with a kiss. It was not gentle like the first, nor was it frantic like the second. It was deep and slow and possessive, a kiss that said, "Yes, we can, and we will." While his mouth moved on mine, his hands were at my hips, skillfully sliding the silk shorts down my legs until they pooled at my feet. I stepped out of them, and then I was standing before him, clad in nothing but a scrap of lace in moonlight. The kiss ended, and he led me to the edge of the large, empty bed, sitting me down on the crisp, cool duvet. And then he did something that shattered my remaining defenses. He knelt on the floor before me. It was an act of worship, not of conquest. He looked up at me, his gaze full of a reverence that made my heart ache. His hands, so sure and strong, began their exploration. They were tentative at first, tracing the lace edge of my bra, then moving to the soft skin of my stomach. "You are so beautiful, Maya," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "God, I've wanted this, I've dreamed of this." His mouth followed his hands. He pressed a line of soft, open-mouthed kisses across my stomach, his touch sending waves of fire through me. My protestations died, replaced by a soft, helpless moan. My back arched, and my hands, of their own accord, found their way into the thick silk of his hair, holding him closer. He moved upwards, his lips tracing a path to the valley between my breasts. With a practiced ease, his fingers found the clasp of my bra at my back, and with a soft click, it came undone. He pulled it away, and my breasts were free, heavy, and aching in the cool air. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated awe. "Perfect," he breathed, before his mouth closed over one nipple, his name a shattered cry on my lips. Every coherent thought dissolved into pure, raw sensation. He was a man, starved, and I was a feast. He laid me back gently onto the bed, the cool sheets, a shocking, delicious contrast to my burning skin. He stood only to shed his own clothes in a series of swift, urgent movements, his eyes never leaving mine. And then he was on the bed with me, his body covering mine, his skin warm and solid and real. This was it. The culmination of every secret look, every whispered confession, every moment of shared loneliness. It was a collision, a frantic, desperate coming together of two people who should have stayed apart. It was clumsy and urgent and beautiful, a dance of tangled limbs and breathless moans. The only sounds in the room, the rustle of sheets and the soft, wet sound of our skin together. He moved within me, and it was a feeling of being filled, of being completed, of a deep, hollow ache. I never knew I had finally been soothed. He whispered my name over and over, a mantra, a prayer. And as the pleasure built, coiling tight and hot in my core, all thoughts of right and wrong, of his wife and my job, they all burned away, leaving only this man, this moment. The release was a cataclysm, a shattering of tension so profound it felt like I was breaking apart and being remade all at once. It ripped through me, drawing a raw cry from my throat, my body arching into his as the world dissolved into a blinding white light. And then, silence. We lay tangled together in the wreckage of the sheets, our bodies damp, our breathing ragged and loud in the quiet room. He collapsed against me, his head buried in the curve of my neck, his weight a comforting, solid presence. The eruption was over. The desperate, consuming fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a warm, glowing ember. He shifted slightly, propping himself up on an elbow to look at me, his face soft in the moonlight. He brushed a damp strand of hair from my forehead, his fingers gentle. "Maya," he whispered, and my name on his lips now sounded different. It sounded like the beginning of something and the end of everything. And as I lay there, sated and trembling in the arms of my boss, my lover, in the bed of a stranger, the first cold tendrils of consequence began to snake their way into the warm afterglow. We had done it, and nothing would ever be the same. I woke to the unfamiliar gray light of dawn in a room that was not my own. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. Then, the events of the night before came rushing back in a tidal wave of sensual memory and cold, hard reality. David was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even, one arm thrown possessively across my waist. In sleep, he looked younger, the lines of stress and unhappiness erased from his face. He looked peaceful. I felt a surge of something warm and dangerously close to tenderness. Then I saw it. On his left hand, resting against the white sheet, was the dull gold of his wedding band. The sight was a splash of icy water, and the guilt I had successfully drowned in a sea of passion came roaring back to life. It was a physical thing, a cold, heavy weight settling in the pit of my stomach. This was not my bed. This was not my man. This was a crime scene, and I was the main accomplice. Moving with the stealth of a thief, I carefully lifted his arm from my body and slipped out of the bed. The cool air on my naked skin felt like an accusation. I gathered my discarded clothes from the floor, my movements quick and silent, my own body feeling alien to me. Dressing felt like putting on a costume, a futile attempt to reassume the role of Maya the nanny after the person who had existed in this room ceased to be her. I crept out of the guest room, pulling the door silently shut, every creak of the floorboards on the way back to my own room sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. Once inside, I leaned against my door, my body trembling. I stripped off the clothes I had just put on. His scent was on them, on my skin, in my hair, and stepped into a shower so hot it was almost painful, scrubbing at my skin as if I could wash away the memory of his touch, the evidence of my transgression. But the feeling was branded onto me, a phantom tingling on my lips, on my neck, between my thighs. I looked at myself in the steamy mirror, at the faint red marks on my collarbone, the slight bruising of my lips. I didn't see myself. I saw a stranger, a cheap cliché, the homewrecker, the girl who slept with her boss. Self-loathing, bitter and acidic, rose in my throat. The next day was a torturous ballet of avoidance. I threw myself into my duties with a frantic energy, using the children as my shield. I was a whirlwind of activity, baking cookies, building elaborate forts, organizing the playroom with meticulous detail. I was louder, my laughter with the children a little too bright, my smiles a little too wide. I was creating a wall of wholesome normalcy to hide behind. David seemed to understand the rules of this new, unspoken game. When he entered a room, I would find an immediate, urgent reason to be in another. We exchanged only the most necessary of words, our voices clipped and polite, the air between us humming with the vast, unsaid truth of what had happened in the guest room. The house, which had been our secret sanctuary, now felt like a cage we were circling each other in, two predators wary of the other's next move. But beneath the surface of my guilt-ridden avoidance, a war was raging. My mind, my treacherous body, refused to forget. As I was spreading peanut butter on a slice of bread for Leo's lunch, I would be hit with a vivid, searing flashback. The look in David's eyes as he knelt before me, the taste of his mouth, the rough scrape of his stubble on the soft skin of my inner thigh. A jolt of pure, unadulterated lust would shoot through me, so powerful it made me grip the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. My body ached. It was an ache of guilt, yes, but it was also a deeper, more primal ache, a craving. I had tasted something I never knew. I was starving for the intoxicating drug of being utterly and completely desired. The feeling of his hands on me, of his mouth on me, of being the sole focus of his entire world had awakened a part of myself I never knew existed. And that part was a greedy, selfish thing that did not care about right or wrong. It only wanted more. David was different too. I could see it in the brief, stolen glances we exchanged. His avoidance was not born of guilt. He was energized, alive. The weariness that had settled deep in his bones seemed to have vanished, replaced by a restless, kinetic energy. He was reckless. As I was loading the dishwasher, he came into the kitchen to get a glass of water. He moved behind me, his body brushing against mine, a slow, deliberate pressure that was in no way accidental. The contact was brief, but it sent a bolt of lightning through my system, every nerve ending screaming to life. I froze, my hands suspended over the rack of dishes. He leaned close to my ear, his breath warm, and whispered, "Good morning, Maya," before walking away as if nothing had happened. He was playing with me, reminding me of our secret, staking his claim. And God help me, it was thrilling. Our secret was no longer a source of shame, it was becoming a source of power. It was a silent, invisible thread that connected us, pulling us taut. A shared look across the room was no longer a question of what if, but a confirmation of what is. We were co-conspirators now, partners in a beautiful, terrible crime. The guilt hadn't vanished, but it was being slowly, surely consumed by the craving. The fear was becoming part of the excitement. That night, after the children were asleep, the pretense of avoidance finally shattered. I was in the kitchen, staring out the window at the dark yard, my mind a chaotic mess. I heard him enter, his footsteps soft but deliberate. I didn't turn. I felt him come to a stop directly behind me. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. The war inside me reached its crescendo. The voice of my conscience screamed at me to run, to end this before it destroyed everything. But the craving, the dark, sweet memory of the pleasure and the validation whispered back, "Stay. You need this. You need him." He placed his hands on my hips, his touch gentle but firm, an undeniable gesture of possession. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply rested his chin on my shoulder, his body pressing against my back, holding me there. Every muscle in my body screamed to pull away, to salvage some last shred of my morality. I did the opposite. With a soft, shuddering sigh of surrender, I leaned back into him, my head falling to rest against his shoulder. The craving had won. The battle was over. This was no longer a one-time mistake. It was the beginning of an affair. The quiet surrender in the kitchen marked a profound shift in the landscape of our affair. The guilt did not vanish, but it receded, becoming a distant, hazy shoreline. In its place, the craving took over, a voracious, insatiable hunger that colored every moment of our days. The avoidance was replaced by a dangerous, thrilling game of proximity. We were partners in a grand conspiracy, and the entire house was our stage. A secret touch as we passed in the hallway, his fingers grazing the small of my back, would send a jolt through my system that left me breathless. A shared glance over the heads of the children at the breakfast table held entire conversations, filled with the memory of the night before and the promise of the night to come. We were addicted to the risk, to the secret knowledge that we held. He was no longer the sad, lonely man I pitied. He was my lover, confident and proprietary, his eyes constantly following me, undressing me, reminding me that I was his. And I was no longer the innocent, conflicted nanny. I was his accomplice, his obsession, and I reveled in the intoxicating power of it. The desire was no longer a slow burn. It was a constant, raging fire. The single night in the guest room had not quenched it. It had only shown us how much more fuel we had to burn. We existed in a state of perpetual, agonizing foreplay. The tension was a physical presence, a hum beneath the surface of our domestic routine. One afternoon, I wore a simple blue cotton sundress. I was in the backyard with the children, and I could feel his eyes on me from his office window for hours. Later, when I was putting away their toys, he came up behind me, pinning me against the wall of the playroom. He didn't say a word, just pressed his body against mine, his mouth finding my neck in a desperate, hungry kiss, one hand sliding up my bare thigh, dangerously close. We heard Leo's footsteps approaching, and we broke apart, our breathing ragged, our eyes wild. The frustration of these stolen, interrupted moments was maddening, winding the spring between us tighter and tighter until it was ready to snap. That night, the spring broke. The children were sound asleep, their soft breathing a gentle rhythm in the quiet house. I was walking down the upstairs hallway towards my room when he stepped out from the shadows of his own doorway. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the reflection of my own frantic, impatient need. There was no hesitation, no question. The time for tenderness and exploration was over. This was about something else. This was about pure, unadulterated need. He took my hand and pulled me, not towards the guest room, but towards his study. The space that had once been the scene of his vulnerable confession was now to become the stage for our most reckless transgression. He guided me inside and locked the door behind us. The sharp, definitive click of the lock was the sound of the world being shut out, the sound of us choosing to be animals in our gilded cage. He pushed me against the door, his mouth crashing down on mine. The kiss was not tender. It was brutal, demanding, a frantic clash of teeth and tongues. It was a kiss that spoke of a day's worth of pent-up frustration and unbearable proximity. My hands flew to his hair, pulling him closer, my body arching into his. It wasn't enough. He broke the kiss, a low growl rumbling in his chest, and in one fluid motion, he lifted me into his arms. He carried me the few feet to his enormous mahogany desk and set me down on its cool, smooth surface, scattering a stack of architectural drawings to the floor. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. In the guest room, he had knelt. Here, he had enthroned me on the very symbol of his professional life, an act of supreme profanity and possession. The skirt of my sundress was bunched up around my waist, and the feel of the cold, polished wood against my bare skin was a shocking, illicit thrill. He stood between my legs, his hands gripping my thighs, his gaze hot and intense. He didn't take the time to remove my dress. He didn't even take the time to remove my underwear. He hooked his thumbs into the waistband of my lace panties, his eyes holding mine, and pushed the delicate fabric to the side. The act was so carnal, so impatient, it stole the breath from my lungs. "Maya," he rasped, his voice a low, ragged command against my ear. "Tell me you want this. I need to hear you say it. It wasn't a request, it was a demand." He wanted my complicity to be total, my surrender to be verbalized. The last vestiges of the shy, hesitant girl I had been were burned away in that moment. I was a creature of pure sensation, of pure need. My voice was a breathless, desperate plea, unrecognizable as my own. "Yes," I gasped, my fingers digging into the hard muscle of his shoulders. "David, please. I want it. I want you right there. Please don't stop." My words were like gasoline on the fire. He drove into me with a force that made me cry out, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain and exquisite pleasure. It was fast, and hard, and frantic. There was nothing gentle about it. This was not the tender, emotional connection of our first time. This was a raw, physical claiming, a desperate release of tension that bordered on violent. The only sounds were my sharp gasps, his low grunts, the rustle of my dress, and the slight rhythmic creak of the heavy desk beneath us. The risk was a potent aphrodisiac, the knowledge that his children were sleeping just a floor above us, separated from our sordid act by nothing but a few feet of wood and plaster, adding a sharp, dangerous edge to every frantic thrust. The climax was a detonation, a quick and violent explosion that left me seeing stars, my body convulsing around him as I screamed his name into the silent, paper-scented air of his office. He followed a moment later, his own release, a guttural groan against my neck. For a moment, we stayed like that, our bodies slick with sweat, our harsh, ragged breathing the only sound. There was no tender afterglow, no whispered endearments. There was only the hum of adrenaline and sated lust. He pulled away, and with a swift, practical efficiency, we began to erase the evidence. He straightened my dress, his fingers brushing my thighs with a familiar intimacy. I fixed my underwear, my hands trembling slightly. We were a practice team of criminals, cleaning up our crime scene. He looked at me, a wild, triumphant gleam in his eyes, and pulled me in for one last hard kiss. Then he unlocked the door, his movements silent and swift. He gestured for me to go, a silent dismissal. I slipped out of the office and back to my room, my body humming, my mind strangely calm. The guilt was a ghost, a faint whisper from a life I no longer lived. I was no longer a girl who had made a mistake. I was a woman in the throes of a reckless, all-consuming affair. And as I lay in my bed, the faint, lingering scent of leather and him on my skin, I knew with a terrifying certainty that I had become addicted to the danger. We were flying too close to the sun, and I didn't care if we got burned. The secret, once a source of intoxicating power, began to feel like a poison seeping into the foundations of the house. In the wake of our reckless encounter in his study, a dangerous confidence had taken root in us. We felt invincible, masters of our own secret universe, and our carelessness grew with every passing day. The affair was no longer confined to the dark, silent hours of the night. It bled into the daylight. It was in the way his hand would linger on mine for a second too long when I passed him a cup of coffee. It was in the private, smirking smiles we'd exchange over the heads of the children, sharing a silent joke about the memory of my legs wrapped around him on his desk. We were two fools dancing on a landmine, so enthralled with the music that we had forgotten the danger beneath our feet. And then, Eleanor came home. Her return was not the dramatic, stormy arrival I had half expected. It was quiet, efficient, and all the more chilling for it. The moment her key turned in the lock, the bubble we had built around ourselves popped, leaving behind a cold, harsh reality. The atmosphere in the house changed instantly. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the warm, illicit world we'd created into a sudden, deep freeze. David's easy confidence evaporated, replaced by a strained formality. My own body tensed, my shoulders hunching up to my ears as I offered a polite, hollow greeting. Eleanor, in her sharp, tailored suit, was the embodiment of the world we had tried to forget, a world of rules and consequences. At first, she said nothing. She was an intelligent woman, a lawyer trained to observe, to gather evidence before presenting a case. She didn't need to find us in bed to know that something was fundamentally broken. She could feel it. The first thing she noticed, I'm sure, was the change in David. He was no longer the resentful, brooding husband she had left behind. He was different. He was cheerful, but in a way that was distant, a way that no longer sought her approval or affection. He had stopped fighting for her attention because he had found a new, devoted audience in me. His happiness was a glaring red flag, a beacon signaling that his needs were being met elsewhere. Then, she turned her sharp, analytical gaze on me, and I crumbled. I could no longer meet her eyes. My easy professional manner was gone, replaced by the flustered, anxious energy of a girl with a terrible secret. I would jump if she spoke my name unexpectedly. I would stammer when she asked a simple question about the children's day. I was a walking, talking embodiment of a guilty conscience, and to a woman like Eleanor, I must have been as easy to read as a children's book. The small, careless mistakes began to accumulate, each one another piece of evidence for her silent prosecution. One evening, she walked into David's study while I was clearing away his dinner tray. She paused in the doorway, her eyes narrowing. "That's a new wine," she commented, her voice deceptively casual, gesturing to the bottle on his desk. It was a cheap, sweet rosé I had bought for myself that David had started drinking with me during our late-night talks. It was a small detail, but it was a detail that was wrong, a foreign object in the carefully curated world of their marriage. I saw her file the information away behind her cool, impassive eyes. A few days later, the carelessness escalated. David and I were in the kitchen, laughing about something one of the children had said. We were standing close, the intimacy between us a palpable, humming thing. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so tender and familiar that for a blissful, stupid moment, I forgot we were not alone in the world. Then I saw her. Eleanor was standing in the doorway, connecting the kitchen to the dining room, holding a file, her face a mask of cold fury. We sprang apart like guilty teenagers, the laughter dying in our throats. The silence that followed was deafening. She didn't say a word about what she'd seen. She simply asked David a question about the file, her voice perfectly even. But the mask had slipped for a fraction of a second, and I had seen the raw, possessive anger beneath. She knew. She might not have had the proof, but in her heart, she knew. From that moment on, the house became a Cold War zone. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Eleanor's politeness became a weapon. a veneer of civility that was sharper and more threatening than any angry outburst. She watched me, constantly. Her eyes would follow me as I moved through a room, her gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight on my skin. She would ask me pointed questions, laced with a sweet, venomous poison. "You seem tired lately, Maya," she'd say, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope David isn't keeping you up too late with work." The thrill of the affair was gone, replaced by a constant, stomach-churning paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected appearance of Eleanor in a room sent a jolt of pure terror through me. The secret that had once been our intimate bond now felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud. David, insulated by a layer of masculine arrogance, seemed less aware of the immediate danger. He still tried to initiate our secret moments, but I was too terrified. I would push his hand away, shake my head, my eyes darting nervously towards the door. The fear was beginning to poison the desire, creating a new, ugly tension between us. The final piece of evidence, the one that sealed our fate, was a text message. It was late. David was in the shower. I was downstairs, but I could picture the scene perfectly. His phone lay on the nightstand, a sleek, black harbinger of doom. It lit up, buzzing softly. And Eleanor, drawn to it like a moth to a flame, looked. The sender's name was Maya. The message was simple, a pathetic attempt to maintain the flimsy facade of our professional relationship. "Just wanted to say thanks again for your help with the leaky faucet today." But it was the little heart emoji at the end of the sentence that damned us. A small, pink, pixelated heart. A symbol of intimacy so casual and so flagrantly inappropriate that it was tantamount to a full confession. That little heart was the final nail in our coffin. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Eleanor now had everything she needed. The hunt was over. She was no longer a suspicious wife. She was a prosecutor, her case file complete, preparing to deliver her closing argument. And as I sat in the silent, tomb-like living room, I could feel the axe hanging over our heads, waiting for the precise, calculated moment to fall. The unraveling was complete. All that was left was the explosion. The announcement of Eleanor's overnight trip to Boston felt like a pardon. For weeks, we had been living under the suffocating shadow of her suspicion, and her departure was a release of pressure so profound it left me feeling dizzy and lightheaded. The cold, tense atmosphere in the house lifted the moment her car disappeared down the driveway. David was visibly relieved, a triumphant, boyish grin spreading across his face. He was convinced her suspicions had been a passing phase, that we had successfully weathered the storm. His confidence was infectious, and against my better judgment, my own paranoia began to recede, replaced by a reckless, desperate need to reconnect with him after days of enforced distance. I told myself this would be the last time, a final, foolish goodbye to the madness that had consumed us. It was a lie, and I knew it. "Tonight, no secrets," David declared, his voice a low, seductive murmur as he cornered me in the kitchen. "No hiding. I want you in my bed." His words sent a jolt of terror and excitement through me. The master bedroom. It was the one line we had never crossed, the one sanctuary we had, by some unspoken agreement, left untouched. It was her space, filled with her things, her scent, her essence. To go there was not just an act of infidelity, it was an act of complete and utter desecration. A part of me, the small, sane part that was still screaming, knew it was a terrible, unforgivable idea. But I had long since stopped listening to that voice. The fear was now inextricably linked to the desire, and the thought of such a profound transgression was the most potent aphrodisiac of all. He led me up the grand staircase, his hand possessively on the small of my back. When he pushed open the door to their bedroom, my breath caught in my throat. It was like stepping into a magazine. A vast California king bed dominated the room, flanked by elegant nightstands. A chaise lounge sat by the window, and a row of built-in closets lined one wall. The room smelled of her, a faint, expensive perfume, and something clean, like fresh linen. It felt like trespassing on holy ground. "She's not here, Maya," David whispered, sensing my hesitation. "Tonight, this is our room." He pulled me towards the bed, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was deep and hungry, a celebration of our perceived freedom. He undressed me slowly, reverently, his eyes worshipping every inch of skin he revealed. He laid me down on the cool, high-thread count sheets that belonged to his wife, and in that moment of supreme betrayal, the last of my reservations burned away. This was the ultimate act of possession for both of us. He was claiming me in the heart of his life, and I was claiming his space, erasing his wife, if only for a few hours. The lovemaking that followed was desperate, frantic, a final, defiant act of two people who believed they had gotten away with it. We were so lost in our own world, so consumed by the friction of skin and the sound of our own breathing, that we didn't hear the car in the driveway. We didn't hear the quiet, almost silent turn of a key in the front door. We were lying in the breathless, tangled aftermath, my head resting on his chest, his fingers idly stroking my hair, when we heard it. A soft, definitive click from downstairs. The sound of the front door closing. David froze beneath me. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice tight with confusion. He sat up, listening. Must be the wind, but it wasn't the wind. A cold, liquid dread began to pour into my veins, turning my limbs to ice. I knew, on some deep primal level, I knew. And then came the footsteps. They were not rushed or angry. They were the slow, deliberate, unhurried footsteps of an executioner. Each soft tread on the staircase was a hammer blow against my heart. Up, up, up they came, a measured, relentless ascent towards our guilt. I scrambled off the bed, my mind a blank wall of pure panic, fumbling for my clothes, for the sheet, for anything to cover my shame. David was still trying to rationalize, to find a logical explanation, his face a mask of disbelief. "Eleanor?" he called out, his voice wavering. The footsteps stopped directly outside the bedroom door. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The door swung open, and there she was. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't crying. Her face was a terrifying, placid mask of calm. She stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in the suit she had left in that morning, her overnight bag resting by her feet. She held her phone in her hand, though she wasn't pointing it at us. Her eyes, cold and dead, took in the scene with a slow, sweeping glance. They took in the rumpled sheets of her bed, the discarded clothes on her floor. They took in her husband, naked and pathetic, sitting up in the bed they shared. And then they landed on me. On me, the nanny, the help, scrambling to cover my nakedness with one of her pillows. The humiliation was so absolute, so crushing, that I thought I might actually die. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. The only sound was the frantic, ragged beat of my own heart. When Eleanor's voice finally cut through the silence, it was low, controlled, and colder than the grave. "Get out of my bed," she said, her gaze fixed on me, each word a perfectly polished shard of ice. David finally found his voice, a weak, pathetic bleat. "Eleanor, honey, this isn't what it looks like. Let me explain." And then, the mask shattered. The calm was annihilated by a wave of pure, primal rage. "Explain!" she shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat, a sound of such profound pain and fury it was almost inhuman. "Explain what, David? How the nanny ended up naked in our bed? The bed where our children were conceived? The bed I sleep in every night? You want to explain that to me?" She took a step into the room, her eyes blazing. She turned her venom on me. "And you," she spat, her lip curling in a sneer of utter disgust. "You pathetic little whore. I welcomed you into my home. My home! I trusted you with the most precious things in my life. And this is how you repay me? You climb into my bed with my husband?" She was advancing on me, and I scrambled backwards on the bed until my back hit the headboard. "I paid you to look after my children," she screamed, her voice breaking with a sob of pure agony, "not to fuck my husband." With a guttural roar, she seized a heavy crystal perfume bottle from her vanity and hurled it against the far wall. It exploded in a shower of glass and expensive fragrance, the violent crash echoing the complete and utter destruction of their lives. The rage subsided as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a devastating, soul-deep sorrow. "My children," she whispered, the words choked with tears as she finally collapsed against the doorframe, her body racked with sobs. "They're sleeping right down the hall." And that was the blow that finally broke me. The thought of those two innocent children, sleeping peacefully while their world was being torn apart just a few feet away, was a pain more profound than any shame or fear. The storm had finally hit, and we were all, every one of us, left drowning in the wreckage. The explosion was followed by a chilling, dead calm. The rage had burned itself out of Eleanor, leaving behind a woman made of ice and shattered glass. Her sobs subsided, replaced by a terrifying, low command. "Get your things," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion, her eyes fixed on me. "Get them now, and get out of my house." David, a pathetic, naked figure still sitting on the edge of his marital bed, said nothing. He couldn't even look at me. He was a ghost, a coward who had evaporated at the first sign of consequence. Under Eleanor's cold, unblinking gaze, I stumbled around the room, gathering my scattered clothes with trembling hands. She followed me to my own room, standing in the doorway like a sentinel, watching as I threw my few belongings into a suitcase. Every book, every sweater, felt like an artifact from a different life. The life of a naive girl who had walked into this house 6 months ago. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket that made it hard to breathe. I didn't cry. The shock was too profound for tears. She escorted me down the grand staircase and to the front door. David was nowhere to be seen. As I stepped out into the humid, pre-dawn darkness, I heard the definitive, final sound of the deadbolt sliding into place behind me. I was left standing on the curb of their perfect, tree-lined street with one suitcase, a paycheck I would never cash, and the indelible stain of what I had done. That was 7 years ago. I never saw or spoke to David or Eleanor again. I don't know the exact details of the fallout, but a painful late-night internet search a few years later confirmed the inevitable. They divorced within the year. The house, their perfect glass and stone mausoleum, was sold. The children I had once cared for, Leo and Sophie, were split between 2 new homes, their lives fractured by a selfish, sordid affair they likely never understood. The wreckage was total. For my part, I drifted for a while, working a series of meaningless jobs, living in cheap apartments, haunted by the ghost of the girl I had been and the woman I had become. The shame eventually hardened into a scar, and I slowly, painstakingly, began to build a new life for myself, one far from the opulent suburbs of Connecticut. I've had years to dissect those 6 months, to replay every glance, every touch, every whispered word, trying to understand the person I was. Was it love? Number? I know that now. Real love doesn't seek to destroy. It doesn't thrive in the dark. It doesn't feed on betrayal. What I felt for David was a potent, addictive cocktail of pity, infatuation, and a desperate, narcissistic need to be seen. He was a handsome, broken man, and I was a lonely, impressionable girl. I saw his sadness and mistook it for depth. He saw my warmth and mistook it for a solution to his problems. We used each other, 2 drowning people clinging to one another, only succeeding in pulling each other further under. I used to see Eleanor as the villain, the cold, ambitious wife who drove her husband into my arms. But time has softened those sharp edges. Now I see her as a woman, flawed and driven, yes, but a woman who was fighting for her own life, who was betrayed in the most intimate way possible in the supposed sanctuary of her own home. The greatest weight I carry is not the loss of David, but the knowledge of the profound and intimate cruelty I inflicted upon another woman. But the hardest person to face has been myself. It would be easy to cast myself as a victim, a young, naive girl seduced by an older, powerful man. And while there is some truth in that, it is not the whole truth. It ignores the dark, thrilling pulse of my own choices. I wasn't just a passive participant. I was an active conspirator. I savored the secret. I reveled in the power I held over him, in the knowledge that I could give him something his beautiful, successful wife could not. I was drawn to the danger, to the transgression. I crossed every line he put in front of me willingly, eagerly, because the fall felt like flying. That is the ugliest truth, and the one I must live with. My life is quiet now. Stable. I have a job I don't hate, a small but comfortable apartment, a handful of friends who know nothing of the girl who was thrown out of a mansion in the middle of the night. The affair feels like a story that happened to someone else. And then, sometimes, it doesn't. Just last week, I was sitting in a coffee shop, watching the rain streak down the window. A man stood at the counter, waiting for his order. He had the same broad shoulders as David, the same dark, thick hair, the same way of leaning his weight on one foot. For one heart-stopping second, the world fell away. The scent of coffee was replaced by the smell of old books and expensive whiskey. The murmur of the cafe was replaced by the sound of his voice whispering my name. The warmth of my mug was replaced by the feel of his hand on my skin. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out on my neck. It was all there, the desire, the fear, the guilt, the thrill, a phantom limb aching with a memory my body has never forgotten. Then the man turned. It wasn't him, of course. Just a stranger. He collected his coffee and left. The moment passed, but it was a stark, visceral reminder. You can leave the past behind, but you can never truly escape it. The passion is gone, the house is sold, the people are ghosts. But the story is a part of me now, a quiet, haunting presence, a permanent scar left by the memory of a forbidden desire that burned so brightly it consumed everything in its path.